Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to be here today. I need to sort of ask your permission and your help today. I've been invited as one of 4 women in ministry to speak next week at Avondale College at a book launch. And we've been each asked to tell our own story. And I have to say, telling God's story is often much easier than telling your own. And so the group of us have been working together, and one of the things that we've been encouraged to do is to practice. And so I thought, this being my local congregation and a kind and loving place, that I would be able to practice my talk for next week here today, in the hope that I can grow and prepare and be ready for next week's presentation at Avondale amongst a whole range of church leaders, and with the hope and prayer in my heart that I will be able to say something that adds to the conversation. The conversation for me is about how we as a church do diversity, how we support people, young and old, male and female, first world and third world, and how we do that in a way that unites us under the banner of Jesus Christ. So that's what I'm hoping to add. That's the conversation I'm hoping to add to. And here's my story as I prepare to go to Avondale next week. As early as I can remember, I wanted to make a difference in the world. I would not have been voted the most likely to succeed. I was a shy and quiet little girl, not so good at school and socially awkward. So I'm still in awe and hugely grateful that I've had the opportunity to lead. First as a volunteer pastor, then a youth pastor, an associate church pastor, a sole charge pastor, in 2006 commissioned as a pastor, then a conference director, a union director, and now as a coach and consultant. And as I look back over the journey, the question comes to mind, what was it like? How was that journey over the past 16 years? Well, there were some interesting opportunities. The opportunity to be the first commissioned pastor in the NZPUC, the first female youth director, union youth director, the first commissioned pastor in Victoria. But that doesn't really describe what the experience was like or what the journey was like. So I need to let you know that as I think about that journey over the past 16 years, I can honestly stand here and say over my journey that I saw at times the best of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where I was so proud to be part of the Seventh-day Adventist community, where I saw faith and grace and forgiveness and love and leadership development and goodness. But I'm sad also to say that in my 16-year journey, that I also had the opportunity to see the worst of my church. That made me cry to the very depths of my soul. I was more than embarrassed. At times, I was in despair. And if I'm honest, the journey was hard. It was hard for a few reasons. It was hard because leadership is hard. It's not an easy journey. If it was, everyone would do it. It was hard because I had my own personal struggles, eating healthy food every day, not realising I was poisoning myself, and wasn't diagnosed with severe food intolerances until 2010, quite a substantial way through the journey. And it was hard because women in ministry were so very new. It wasn't that people disagreed theologically with women in ministry, it's that often they'd never dealt with a woman leader before, and they weren't quite sure where this journey was going. The best way for me to describe it is to borrow from Reggie Joyner, who runs the movement Think Orange. He bought a motorbike a few years ago, and his wife bought him some lessons. And he went to the motorbike lessons, and the guy put cones out, like there on the screen, and said, weave your way through the cones. So he got on his bike and gets round the first cone and he falls, hits the cone. So tries again, and he knows, he's got this figured that there's no way his wife's going to let him on the road with that bike until these lessons are passed. So he's trying really hard. He's on his cone, he's trying to get around the cones, but he can't do it. And the instructor went and stood at the very end of the cones. And he said, "Don't look at the cones, look at me. Keep the cones in your periphery vision, look forward to the goal ahead and weave." Did it first time. And as I think back over that illustration and that example, I think it's a really great example of integrated strategy, of not just doing what's right in front of us right now, but actually looking to the path ahead and strategically, with everything that's going on in our periphery vision, moving towards the goal that God has placed on our heart, the call that God has placed on our heart. But for me, I quite wasn't sure how to do that. And I felt like at every stage of my ministry journey, I was just looking at the cone in front of me, stumbling along, going, how do I do this? How will this work? Trying to look up to see if there was a future and a forward direction, but being quite uncertain. I probably can't tell this story next week, but I will tell it to you today. I remember being 23 years old, sitting with the ministerial secretary saying, do you think maybe I could one day pastor a little church in the country? He said, I'm not sure the country would have you. And I said, you don't have enough faith, because if you had enough faith, you would send me to the lions and you would see what God could do. The problem is that man's now the division president. I hope he's forgotten our conversation. Each time I was trying to work out what to do, I would go down and I would look at the shelves of a bookstore and I would think, which book will guide me, and I would talk to anyone who would listen to me, and I would stumble on help in all sorts of bizarre and unusual places. I felt like my journey was more like this. In 2001, one of my buddies from university called me up and said he was studying this thing called coaching. I'd never heard of it, and most people hadn't in 2001, and he wondered if I could be his practice person. And I loved the first session and immediately joined up, and it ignited a passion in me that has led me to find a simple path through the chaos, and why I stand here today working as a professional coach who predominantly supports women leaders. I felt, though, like I desperately needed a mentor, somebody who'd gone ahead of me on the journey to help me along the way. And there were a few attempts to find a mentor for me, but that didn't quite work. So one day I went to a seminar by Dr. John Mallison, who used to be the head of the Uniting Church in Australia, and he wrote the book Mentoring. And I sat in in the seminar, and I raised my hand and asked a few questions, and in front of everybody he said, "I'll speak to you at morning tea time." And I was like, in the principal's office instantly. I really thought that the ex-head of the Uniting Church in Australia was about to get me in trouble. And so at morning tea time, as he would walk around the table towards me, I would walk around away from him. And good on his tenacity, he chased me around the table until finally he got me, said, "Right, I just felt for you sitting there, the only girl." He said, "I'm going to find you a mentor." I'd heard those kinds of things before, I was not certain. But I remember 6 weeks later, driving along the Melbourne freeway and getting this phone call and saying, "Hi Kylie, it's Dr. John Mallison here." He's just saying it like it's past the butter, and here's the ex-head of the Uniting Church in Australia ringing an intern from the Victorian Conference of the Seventh Adventist Church. He said, "I've got you a mentor. She's a reverend in the Anglican Church, and she's willing to meet with you." She wasn't just willing to meet with me, she was willing to walk with me. She met with me every month for 4 years. And she was willing to challenge me and say, What are your spiritual gifts? And I said, hospitality. She said, what about leadership? I'm like, women aren't leaders. I'm not a leader. She looked at me and she said, where did that come from, Kylie? And for months and months, she slowly built a foundation in me that helped me to understand that we are all leaders. First of ourselves, then of our families, and then sometimes in positional leadership in our work, communities and churches. I guess in some ways, I could say that in the midst of adversity, I stumbled along to find what I needed. But I'm a person of faith and don't believe in coincidence. I believe coincidence is when God works a miracle and decides to remain anonymous. God seems to specialise in building leaders. He seems to specialise in building leaders in the face of adversity. The Bible character that resonates so strongly with me is the story of Joseph. He was a young man who had a call on his heart to lead. God placed dreams on his heart. But of course, he was one of the youngest in the family, and in his culture and in his time, young people didn't lead. The firstborns were leaders. And we know how Joseph's journey went. He was sold into slavery, he went to prison, he was overlooked, he was betrayed, he was misrepresented, and he was mistreated. And we don't know how he felt all the way along the journey. The Bible doesn't tell us whether he felt self-pity or despair on the camel, or what it was like when he was thrown into prison. But we do get a glimpse of what's happening in his heart right at the end of his journey. It's in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. So let's just look at the context of these verses before I read them. Joseph is now the Prime Minister of Egypt, and his family has been living with him for 7 years. When he first came in contact with his family, he checked on them to see whether they were safe people to have back in his life. And then he invited them to his table, the table of the Prime Minister of the nation, where there would have been the best food, the best support. They would have lived in a palace. But when their dad dies, the brothers get a bit concerned. They wonder, now that dad's gone, will Joseph use his power and end their lives? And they send him a letter saying, please don't kill us, and begging for his forgiveness. Asking for something that Joseph had done so many years earlier. And Joseph calls his brothers before him, and he stands before his brothers and he says these beautiful words. He says, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph, over his journey, has learnt an important lesson. He's learnt that God is God and he is not. It's a powerful lesson to learn, that there is a God in the universe who sits on his throne and is at work in our lives and in our nations and in our world. And while all that happened through Joseph's journey was intended to harm, in fact, some versions say, and I love it this way, it says, what the devil intended for evil. For all those bits of adversity that the devil was going to pull this leader down, that God used them for good. Because God is on a mission to build leaders for his kingdom. Leaders of all forms, leaders in families, leaders in ministry, leaders in our world. God is strategic in his goal to build mature leaders for his kingdom. And you see Joseph standing there speaking with a sense of seasoned, mature leadership. I'd call it grown-up leadership. You sort of see his brothers go, you go and talk to Joseph. No, you go and talk to Joseph. Let's all hold hands. Let's go together. You've got this sense of them kind of still, kind of almost like teenagers, kind of hanging together. And you see Joseph stand up in the moment where he would have had every right to say, "You lot drove me absolutely nuts. Look what you did to me." But he takes the grown-up ground. He takes the high ground. And he says, "It's okay. I'm not God. God's going to deal with it." And God did. Every time something was intended for harm, God used it to build Joseph, to build him into a mature, grown-up leader. It makes me ask the question, am I becoming who God is calling me to be? Am I maturing as a leader of myself, my family, my community, my church, my world? These passages were said by Joseph at the end of his journey, not long before the end of his life. And I am still only halfway through my journey. I have way more to go. And these days, though, I now know what the end goal is. I know the goal is to be a mature, grown-up leader. That it's not about my position or my task, but about who I become and being the leader that God needs me to be in the world. I can tell you halfway through my journey without a shadow of a doubt that there are no mistakes in the way God builds leaders, that he has and is strategically involved in all of our lives. Please don't misunderstand me in any way. I know that we as a church need to partner with God and reflect his character, and that there's the challenge for all of us as we work together to build our leaders in a strategic way, to work with God and not let leadership happen by accident, but by happening with intentionality and with strategy, from the cradle to the grave. Maybe the next leader that our church needs is actually at the moment sitting at our feet. And how do we build leaders from the moment that they join us until the moment that God gets them ready to take them home? I would have loved that if along my journey there was somebody who'd been on the path before me who had skills in coaching and mentoring, who knows the pitfalls, to go, "Hey, how do we strategically build Kylie with her giftedness?" And I stumbled along those things. But I call us to partner with a strategic God and to be strategic about how we build leaders in the world. Whether we are growing and maturing or not, I know without a shadow of a doubt that my God is a God who builds leaders and who's building leaders for his kingdom and to make a difference in the world. I can stand here today and say this to you because I know he did it in me.